I want to introduce you to Julie Allen. Julie Allen is a professor of comparative literature who focuses on Danish and Scandinavian literatures, who will introduce our speaker. Julie.
It's such a pleasure for me to have this chance to have Kirsten Thisted on campus. I've had the pleasure of knowing Kirsten for about the last 15 years. She was a Fulbright fellow at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I was teaching Scandinavian studies, and came and introduced us. And I had a sort of similar mind-blowing experience that I'm hoping we'll have today of recognizing just the limitations of what I had even known I didn't know. And so Kirsten's work on Greenland and the relationship between Greenland and Denmark, and just generally the questions of post-colonial relationships and minority studies. She's in the Department of Minority Studies at the University of Copenhagen. It's such an important field that I think we can all learn from. And on top of that, Kirsten is a really delightful person, and she's had a great time on campus. I have exploited her shamelessly to come and talk to all of my classes and some of my colleagues' classes, because I feel like she has such an important perspective to help us understand. And so I also took her to the Homecoming Spectacular kickoff yesterday, which was, I think, a little bit mind-blowing for her and Jan in a very positive way. So well done for representing BYU so well. But Kirsten is a professor, as I said, at the University of Copenhagen in the Minority Studies. She's also a sometimes professor, an adjunct or associate professor at the University of Greenland, Dusafik. Been working on that all morning, and has a lot of first-hand experience with what Greenland is experiencing, trying to come into the world on its own terms after many centuries of being sort of, what's the word, mediated by Denmark or buffered by Denmark from the world. But I loved what she said in my class yesterday, is that even though we haven't been paying attention to Greenland, Greenland has been paying attention to us. And so they're very familiar with American pop culture, and they know a lot about the world that we inhabit, and I think it's about time we return the favor, so I'm glad that Kirsten could come today.
Yeah, thank you so much for this kind introduction, and thank you so much for inviting me. I really am enjoying my time here at your campus. I have borrowed the title for this presentation from a 2-volume book I published a few years ago together with colleagues from Norway, Iceland, Faroe Islands, and Greenland. Within the Nordic region, these nations, also known as the West Nordics, form a political and cooperative alliance. Usually they are studied individually. Even in books about the West Nordics, each country often has its own chapter with little comparison between them. Our goal in this project was to focus on comparisons, so experts from each country collaborated, and we really collaborated. We co-authored every chapter. So that was hard work. It took some years, but we believe that the book came out very beautifully illustrated and with lots of interesting texts. So while these North Atlantic countries often emphasize their cultural and historical similarities, such as extensive coastlines and cold climates, we found that the true bond lies in the shared history as part of the former Danish or Danish-Norwegian Empire, which has gradually dissolved over time. When we speak about the new North Atlantic, it reflects the shifting power dynamics toward the north, with Denmark increasingly being sidelined. Although Denmark still plays a formal role, efforts from the northern regions are aimed at reducing and ideally eliminating the Danish influence, I have to say. So, in this presentation, I will begin by highlighting some of the most significant historical differences between the West Nordic countries before turning to Greenland, and the ongoing renegotiation of history between Denmark and Greenland. In the Scandinavian countries, we are accustomed to viewing the map as we do here. However, when we consider them from a different perspective, it becomes evident that our geographical perception of Greenland is influenced more by historical rather than geographical factors. The Faroe Islands actually are so small that on the map on the left they have been enlarged for us to even notice them, or else they would have drowned in the big sea there. Actually, Iceland is situated under the Arctic Circle, and so is the Faroe Islands. But that problem is solved by looking at climate rather than latitude. As on this cover of the Faroe Islands Arctic Strategy from 2013, there's this small dip southwards, including the Faroe Islands. So what is actually the Arctic is debatable. On this map, here, on this map, a humorous soul has had fun coloring countries larger than Denmark in green, while the countries smaller than Denmark are purple. And that is, of course, as long as Greenland is still considered a part of Denmark. This will radically change the minute they leave us. So, the thing is that in international affairs, Denmark has quite another role with Greenland than without Greenland. For instance, Denmark only has a seat in the Arctic Council as long as Greenland remains part of the Kingdom of Denmark, while Greenland has a hard time understanding why it is Denmark who should occupy this seat, as if Greenland, the Faroe Islands, and Denmark are truly equal partners in the community of the realm. We call it rigsfællesskabet. So Greenland simply cannot understand, well, since we are the Arctic, then why is Denmark the head of it? And if we are really equal partners, then still, why is it Denmark who is sitting at the end of the table? Since the law on Greenlandic self-government from 2009, this has been the rhetoric. The Kingdom of Denmark consists of 3 partners, like what you see here. The Danish state is essentially represented by the Danish government and parliament, where the Faroe Islands and Greenland are allocated 2 seats each. The North Atlantic self-governance arrangement grants sovereignty only in domestic affairs, while matters of security and foreign policy remain under the authority of the Danish state. So, what you see here in this picture is the ideal or official image. However, where do I point this so that it works? Yeah. However, in Greenland and the Faroe Islands, there is a sense that what is often called Denmark proper is the realm, leaving them as marginalized minorities within the structure. The primary reason that the Faroe Islands and Greenland haven't severed ties long ago is economic. Both territories have built their economies on financial transfers from Denmark known as the block grant. While the Faroe Islands have increasingly reduced their reliance on it, for Greenland it remains essential to keeping the economy afloat and maintaining their status as a part of the Scandinavian welfare model. They simply cannot do in Greenland without the Danish money. So now let us have a look into history in order to better understand the next subject in this presentation, the present-day hierarchies. In order to understand the West Nordic region, we need to go all the way back to the Kalmar Union, which in 1397 brought the kingdoms of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark together under a single monarch. When Sweden left the Union in 1536, Norway came under Danish monarch, but remained a country, even in the rhetoric of the Danish state. We always accepted that Norway was a country in its own right. This ended after the Napoleonic Wars at the Treaty of Kiel in 1814, when Denmark was forced to cede Norway to Sweden. Norway became an independent nation in 1905. However, at the Treaty of Kiel, Denmark got to maintain Iceland, the Faroe Islands, and Greenland. Iceland and Faroe Islands had, since long before the Kalmar Union, been Norwegian vassal states or tributary states, meaning that they paid taxes to Norway in order for Norway to keep the ship traffic open, like, you know, in the Middle Ages when the Norse settlers were in Greenland. However, the connection was broken, the Old Norse disappeared from Greenland, and the country was taken over by the Inuit, who had come across from what is now Canada and Alaska. The Greenlandic Inuit were colonized by the Danish Norwegian Kingdom in 1721. So while the Icelanders and the Faroese had come from Scandinavia, the Inuit were a completely different people and culture, then known to be heathen and primitive. So Norway, Iceland, Greenland, and the Faroe Islands may have been under Danish rule, but they have been it under very different terms. That is also why usually historians talk about Iceland and the Faroe Islands as dependencies, while it certainly makes sense to talk about the Danish engagement in Greenland as a colonization. Likewise, the Sami people characterize the Scandinavian settlement further and further north in Scandinavia as an internal colonization. The Scandinavians did not cross any water in order to colonize a foreign people, but this is what they did anyway, according to the Sami people. However, this also serves as a rationale for the hierarchy that exists internally among the North Atlantic or West Nordic countries. In 2008, the North Atlantic Corporation published a small booklet called North Atlantic Faces. It has been on their homepage ever since, and they actually sell it. The reason that there may not be any strong common identity, but that they wanted with publications like this one to create such a common identity. So they sent a journalist from one of the countries to another. So a Greenlandic journalist went to Iceland, a Norwegian journalist to Greenland, a Faroese journalist to coastal Norway, and an Icelandic journalist to the Faroe Islands. What comes out of it is not a community, but a hierarchy. At the top is Norway, which is a well-established, old, but now modern nation-state. Then comes Iceland, which is a young, but also well-established, well-run nation-state. Then the Faroe Islands, which are described as Iceland's past, a bit backwards, but on the way. And then Greenland, which with great admiration looks up to Iceland as their own future, but are looked down upon by the Norwegian journalist. I quote here from his description of Greenland, of Greenland's capital, Nuuk. The eye experiences a mixture of Murmansk, which has similar dilapidated housing blocks to those in Nuuk from the 60s, of Hammerfest, because they have an airport which can only handle small aircraft and lies between fjord and mountain, and also of Kautokeino. Kautokeino, that is Norway's center for Sami culture and politics. Also of Kautokeino, a folkloristic gathering place for old kofter, that is the Sami national costume, closer to a North Cape version, end of quote. So when walking in the streets of Nuuk, the Greenlanders make the journalists think of, quote, indigenous peoples from other inhospitable places, unquote. At the bottom of all of this are the Sami people who are never even given their own voice in this booklet. The only representation of them is this rather racist description that you just heard, and then a somewhat more positive mention by a Japanese tourist who has come to Norway to experience them. But we never get to meet a Sami person face to face in this publication. So while all the other places are described as feeling like home, To Scandinavians, anything related to indigenous peoples are portrayed as foreign, often compared to Soviet Siberia. It's clear that some feel more at home in this region than others, and it's not hard to understand why the indigenous peoples react to this. Although the tone has shifted significantly since this publication, the underlying attitudes may not always have changed. It is a great mystery, actually, to me, why this publication has not been removed from the website a long time ago. But it is interesting because it is so explicit about something which is usually not spoken out loud, at least not in public. So now let us turn to post-colonial Greenland. Scandals related to Greenland have been piling up, creating a serious headache for the Danish government. For decenniums, the Greenlanders have been talking about forced relocation of people from small settlements to larger urban areas, including the forced relocation of the Thule people in order to make room for the US Thule Air Base, and about a discriminatory wage system that automatically paid significantly higher salaries to Danes than to Greenlanders. In recent years, however, a series of cases have drawn considerable attention from the Danish public, reinforcing the perspective that the Danish state has overstepped its bounds. What you saw here, the last picture, is a case about children sent to Denmark and maybe adopted by Danish parents without a clear consent from the Greenlandic parents. And lately here, the so-called IUD campaign, in which Greenlandic women and girls down to 12 years old were systematically fitted with these devices, seemingly without their consent, complicates, all of this complicates Denmark's ability to uphold the old narrative of being a good, well-meaning and altruistic colonial power. This photograph is from a Danish kingdom meeting between Denmark, Greenland, and the Faroe Islands, where Greenland's then political leader, Alra Hammond, launched the idea of a Greenlandic Reconciliation Commission aimed at clarifying the course of the modernization process in Greenland after World War II. As the photo suggests, the chemistry between the Danish and the Greenlandic leaders may not have been ideal or very warm. In any case, the Danish government politely declined to participate. From the Greenlandic side, the intention may have been more about uniting the Greenlandic population and encouraging the Greenlanders to consider ideas of decolonization and full independence than actually reconciliation or reconciling with Denmark. We are not really friends here, okay. However, in 2022, the Danish and Greenlandic leaders signed an agreement to establish a historical commission aimed at shedding light on the post-World War II developments. That is the official statement. What they will be looking into is especially the possible abuses in Greenland by the former Danish colonial powers and more recent Danish governments. Now, let us have a closer look at this idea about the benevolent Danish colonial rule. Many colonial powers have situated themselves within a burden of civilization narrative, where their sole intention was to educate the natives and incorporate them into the benefits of civilization. Denmark has polished this narrative to perfection, particularly through the notion of a small country extending a helping hand to another small people. So there are a lot of affect and emotion involved in this narrative. The argument of this paper is that we must show analytical interest in these sentiments. This painting of Prime Minister Thorvald Stauning in role of Father of the Nation was painted in 1937. That is during the heyday of colonial times. Stauning is a man with a beard and glasses at the center of the picture. All professional groups of society are represented, including a Faroese fisherman who stands fourth from the left in the back row. They are all adults listening attentively to the wise words of the tall man. The only child is the little Greenlandic boy. Although he cannot keep up with the conversation, he entrusts his upbringing and future to the man in which arms he safely rests, symbolizing how the Greenlanders entrust their future to the Danes and to the Danish state. Greenlandic sources from the 1930s depict a contrasting image of the Danish colonial rule. I find it relevant to talk about affective economies here. The concept is borrowed from Sarah Ahmed, a prominent scholar in postcolonial and critical race studies. We're not only talking about an exchange based on goods and money. To the colonial circulation of goods and knowledge is linked another kind of economy based on emotions. Back in 1905, the Minister of Finance, Carl Theodor Zahle, during the budget negotiations stated, quote, "There cannot be just a splash of self-interest in our relationship with the Greenlanders," unquote. With these words, Minister Zahle was persuading the Danish parliament to introduce a new logic in relation to the traditional colonial logic, which is about, of course, making money on the colony. Zahle was inspired by Lieutenant Emil Blume, who in his book From a Stay in Greenland, 1863 to 64, wrote, quote, "Rather than benefiting Denmark, the trade monopoly must benefit the Greenlanders so that the Greenlanders can become living witnesses of little Denmark's use of civilization and freedom." In other words, Blume wanted Denmark to exchange its financial earnings from Greenland for cultural capital. So, from then on, the logic has been this perpetual circle. Due to their love for the Greenlandic people, the Danes sent merchandise, investments, and expertise to Greenland. In return, they expect the love and gratitude and a certain subordination of the Greenlandic people, which would also trigger the international community's recognition and thus return the investments in the form of cultural capital, which in the international community would attract networks and thereby also financial capital, also returning to Denmark. And this capital, financial capital also now, could then be reinvested in Greenland due to the love and responsibility and so on, and then the circle could go on. In effect, the Danish body, inserted in the subject position of the generous giver, has become associated with pride and abundance, modernity and progress, while the Greenlandic body, inserted in the subordinate position of the constant receiver, has become associated with inferiority and thus shame. Because when you're in the position of always receiving, you end up in this position with feeling shame of what you are. And understandably, the Greenlanders want out of this. Of course, they can hope for the Danes to change their attitude, and things are changing, as indicated by the new willingness in Denmark to discuss history. Another option is to begin collaborating with other partners where more equitable relationships can be built. The North Atlantic, Norway, Iceland, and the Faroe Islands seem relevant here, and especially the Icelanders are interested. In our project, Denmark and the New North Atlantic, we investigated how during earlier times the Icelanders turned their back on Greenland, facing Europe. It was important to the Icelanders to claim their membership within European civilization. So there is no trace of brotherhood with the native Greenlanders before around 2010. Do you get this? I mean, they really wanted, often they would state the sentence, "We are not Skrællinger." Skrællinger, that was a very derogative word for the then Eskimos back in the Icelandic sagas. They did not want to be associated with the Greenlanders. All this changed around 2010. From then on, Iceland and Greenland have, according to shifting Icelandic politicians, become best friends in the Arctic, and new agreements have been made. To the former Icelandic Prime Minister Ólafur Ragnar Grímsson, it is important to establish Iceland and Greenland with the Faroe Islands on the periphery as a special central division of the Arctic. Maybe you can read together with me here. To put the Arctic in context, the area is as large as Africa. I often find it convenient to divide the Arctic into three parts. The vast eastern area stretches from Bering Strait across 7 time zones in Russia, ending in 3 small areas in the north of Norway, Sweden, and Finland. The western area covers Alaska and the Canadian Arctic. The central area, which includes Iceland and Greenland, extends from the North Pole south across the Atlantic Ocean, covering the vast territories of Greenland and Iceland, with the Faroe Islands on the periphery. It is this area that globally is fast becoming a focal point due to the security interest of the superpowers, as well as its proximity to the new trans-Arctic shipping routes, not to mention the importance of Greenland. The central area is also where climate change is most obvious in the world. So, this, of course, all sounds very good, but Greenland has an equally long history with Iceland, as well as with the Faroe Islands and Norway, as with Denmark, likewise based on asymmetrical power relations and stereotypical perceptions, as indicated by the text in the booklet I showed you, the North Atlantic Faces. You can read much more about these past and present relations in our book, Denmark and the New North Atlantic, including how Icelandic politicians as late as 1948 discussed Iceland's right to claim Greenland an Icelandic colony, or at least a sphere of interest. Even today, the Icelanders often talk about the Greenlanders not as brothers, but as younger brothers, indicating an asymmetrical power relation. The Greenlanders, of course, know this, so therefore they also seek as many relationships around the world as possible, because, of course, they are afraid that these old hierarchies that we all want to, deconstruct by now, that maybe they will still somehow survive and be there underneath all the nice talk about equality. So they really want to establish as many relationships around the world as possible, preferably new relationships without too many constraining historical ties, because history, it has this tendency to not really go away. So in addition to the representation in Denmark, Greenland has representations in Brussels, Belgium, in Beijing, China, in Reykjavik, Iceland, and in Washington. And another representation in New York is being planned. So, while in Denmark we are working to craft a new narrative about our relationship with Greenland, one that reflects Danish involvement more honestly, without casting us as outright monsters, Greenland is contemplating its own future. Should the country pursue large-scale projects, mining and industrialization, or should they focus on preserving and perhaps revitalizing its indigenous culture? Or is there a way to balance both paths? A preliminary report from Greenland's Constitutional Commission was released in 2023 and is now under public consultation both in the Greenlandic Parliament and among the broader population. And I think I have maybe 2 minutes more, then I want to, since none of you have ever been here, I want to give you a few figures here to show you where you are. When we say Greenland, when we say indigenous peoples in the Arctic, this is usually what you would imagine, right? This proud hunter having just caught a polar bear and he's there with his dogs and so on. However, the reality that will meet you if you go there is much more like this. So a few numbers here. Over 60% of Greenland's population live in the 5 largest cities, Nuuk, Sisimiut, Ilulissat, Aasiaat, and Qaqortoq. And as you can see from the figures here, the numbers here, just over a third of the population live in the capital Nuuk, which is definitely very urbanized. So Greenland does not have a uniform population because still there are 40% living in smaller areas, and even still some in the hunting cultures, even though those are getting smaller and smaller, people are moving to the bigger cities. And now Greenland is becoming a migration nation, preferably with people from the South Asia, Thai people and people from the Philippines working in the fishing industry and in the service employments. So this is the book, and this is the people who joined the book from the University of Copenhagen, Háskóla Íslands, Ilisimatusarfik, and the University of the Faroe Islands, University of Oslo, and the Arctic University of Norway in Tromsø. And we did several, it's actually a 2-volume book, as you see. We did something about an introductory section on current narrative and official discourses, then a historical one with how this empire was and how it was dissolved. Something about how we imagine the North Atlantic, and more about how we shape it in these narratives of purity and authenticity, as for instance in the branding and the tourism branding and so on. Then something about national gender trouble, race, bodies and sexualities. Something about memory culture in this region, and finally sovereignty, constitutions and natural resources. Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Thisted. We're really grateful for what we've learned from you. We do have about 20 minutes to engage in conversation. The way that this will work is that we have a couple of gentlemen on each side of the room that have microphones, and if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand. We'll get a microphone to you. We invite you to stand, just tell us your name, and share your question from where you're at. If you do need to leave early to get to a 1 o'clock class, we understand that, and you're welcome to do that, but we will go till about 1 o'clock. And I might just take the first opportunity to ask a question, if that's okay. I found this a very fascinating presentation, and I'm wondering if based on your extensive experience in Greenland and other parts of the North Atlantic, what can you teach us about perceptions of Denmark by Greenlanders today, or by Faroe Islanders today? How do they see Denmark in their lives? What is the stories they tell themselves about what Denmark is?
That definitely depends on who you ask. Because, Greenland has 2 sets of relatives or forefathers. And the one set, obviously, is the other Inuit So they're closely related to the Inuit in Canada and in the eastern part of Alaska. But then the other set of relatives, that is the Scandinavians. So when they talk about my forefather, they'll usually talk about the person who came from most often Denmark and who gave the family its surname. But when they talk about Siulivut, our forefathers, then they mean the other Inuit. So they do respect this dual heritage, and this dual heritage is also incorporated in the name of in the name they give themselves as a people. They call themselves Galaslit, very often with Inuit after. So they call themselves Galaslit Inuit. Or if they want to underline the fact that they are Inuit, they would put Inuit first and say Inuit Galaslit. And Greenland is called Galaslit Nunad, the land of the Galaslit people. And the Galaslit, they identify themselves as a mixture of European and Inuit heritage. So, most of them have Danes in their close family. And some young Greenlanders, especially in Nuuk, do not speak Galaslisut, that is the West Greenlandic language. They speak Danish. And it is a great sorrow that they lost the Greenlandic language, because they feel that this is the language that belongs to the land, the language that will describe the land with the fjords and the ice and so on. So it's a great loss due to colonialism and Danification after World War II. Also, it is a historic fact that the Greenlanders wanted this modernization process, but they had never thought that it would go so fast. They had never thought that, they had never wanted that learning Danish would be at the expense of losing Greenlandic. So they tell different stories from who you speak to. There is a small group of young activists who will speak very harshly about Denmark, but still they also have this attachment, and they of course acknowledge that Denmark and Greenland, we are so interwoven, we are so entangled, we do not have the same history. Danes like to talk about Greenlanders and Danes having a shared history. No, we don't. We have entangled histories, because the way that we tell this history, those two ways, from a Greenlandic view and from a Danish perspective, they are so different. It's not a shared history, but it's an entangled history. You cannot tell one without telling the other. So, yeah, was that an answer? Yes. Any more questions? Yes.
Vi kommer nok til at tale dansk lidt senere. So I think this is super fascinating because I grew up in Denmark, and we have this weird perspective of Greenland that we never thought Greenland was kind of a part of Denmark and kind of not. But I'm curious to know what normal Danes can do to better unite the two nations. Like Greenland and Denmark, what can normal Danish people do in Denmark to better unite?
Honestly, I think that this is too late. We cannot anymore unite these two nations. Maybe we had a chance back in 53 when Greenland became what we called it an equal part of Denmark. If at that point Denmark had stopped the colonial rule and changed it into equality, then maybe we could have become one nation. But since Denmark continued its colonial rule, and maybe even to some extent still continues a colonial rule in Greenland, this is not going to happen today. What we will have to do in Denmark is to listen to the Greenlanders, hear what they are saying, even when we don't think it's really fair. Even when, as I said before, hey, you Greenlandic politicians, you really wanted modernization. back in 53, yeah, but we didn't want it the way that you carried it out. We have to listen to all these stories and form new narratives based on equality, and then find new ways of having it. What the Greenlanders want may not be a total separation. They talk about a free association, meaning that they will sit at the head of the table on an equal part with Denmark and the Faroe Islands, and that is what the Faroe Islands also want. And we have to find new ways, or Greenland has to find new ways to develop the economy so that they are not dependent on Denmark. And that is what they are trying with mining industry and so on, which also separates the country, because do they want to become this industrialized mining country, or do they want to, can they somehow, indigenize modernity? Is that possible? So that actually divides the population very much. It's not that all Greenlanders are pro-mining to some extent, but not in my backyard, You know that probably. Yes.
Thanks so much. I'm a linguist. I have a question about language. Going back to your answer to the first question, you mentioned that 60% of the population lives in the 5 largest cities. I think it was a third in the capital itself. Can you talk more about the language landscape and situation there? I assume Danish is the prestigious or elite language, and Greenlandic is not. Do you have a sense on how many monolingual speakers there are of Danish or Greenlandic in those big cities? And a follow-up question, do they offer second language Greenlandic in Denmark?
Yes, to the last question, but not very much. You have to be in Copenhagen, and second language education in Greenlandic, that is very bad. The situation in Greenland is that after World War II, Danish became the high status language, and Greenlandic the lower one, seen as primitive, backwards, and maybe not useful anymore. And that was, of course, a big mistake. So at some point they have to say, we are not a bilingual country. 2 languages are spoken here, but by a different set of people. And that is not very smart way to and a lot of people suffered from this. People were, the students in school, they were divided into A and B classes, A for Greenlandic classes and B for Danish classes. So this separated the population. It was awful. And even, the elite children, they would go to the Danish class because they wanted them to go to Denmark and have an education, right? So, and then they lost the Greenlandic language. And that, as I said, was never intended by the politicians who wanted Greenland to modernize. But then in 1979, Greenlandic became the first language with the Home Rule law. Greenlandic became the first language of the nation, and then there was a passage that said that Danish must be taught and spoken also. That last thing disappeared in 2009 when this Home Rule Act was extended into self-government, and so now it's just that Kalaallisut is the official language in Greenland. So now Danish is a minority language, but it is a high status language because so many of the elite and so much of the administration, you have the politicians, they speak, most of them, Greenlandic. Almost all of them, not all, but almost all. But then the administration, the lawyers and so on, they speak Danish, so everything has to be translated, and it's so heavy, right? And then Greenland has also its own minorities. They call them dialects, but actually you could call them languages. It is Inupiat languages, but East Greenlandic, you cannot understand it being a West Greenlander. So in East Greenland and up in Thule in the northernmost part, There are not so many people, but some thousands. They speak West Greenlandic as a first foreign language. So they are in the position now where the West Greenlanders have always been, that they would, or been after the Second World War, that they are taught in a language that is not their mother tongue or not their first language. Yeah, so the language situation is complicated. But they're really working on it, I have to say. Really, really. Everything is being translated. And we have lately had an interesting event in the Danish parliament where one of the Greenlandic politicians, one of the two representatives from Greenland in the Danish parliament, she insisted on speaking Galaslisut in the Danish parliament, making it clear to everyone that this situation where Danes and Greenlanders unified is not really working. Because if we had to translate everything into Galaslisut, that would cost a lot of money. I mean, really a lot of money. And they don't even have enough translators for it. But it is hilarious that the people in Greenland that we call Danish citizens cannot understand what's going on in the Danish parliament. Of course, you can then say, yeah, that is why you have self-government, where you can decide on all internal affairs. The Self-Government Act grants Greenland the sovereignty in all internal affairs, but not in foreign policies and security.
Can you describe what the Greenlandic government looks like?
What it looks like.
How is it organized, and is it and how do they deal with the East-West split in terms of shared representation, or is it more of a theoretical government still, or is it?
No. Okay. It's definitely a government. Okay. It's called Inatsisartut. The parliament, the government is Naalakkersuisut. And in Inatsisartut are all the Greenlandic parties that were elected. And they have tried to include East Greenland and Thule by including East Greenland into the Samarsoq municipality, where they are together with Nuuk. And the Thule in the northernmost municipality, so that these minorities are actually included. They will say that they are still minorities, but yes, it's definitely a parliament, and it works just like the Danish Folketing, the Danish parliament. Actually, of course, this is where they learned how to do democracy. So very much the Greenlandic idea of a nation state that was introduced by Denmark. So we have the German model, with the ethnicity, and it's about your heritage and so on. Danes imported that from Germany. So it's not the American model where it's most of all subjective. This is an objective. You were born it. You didn't choose it. So they have imported that, and they have imported very much, the way to act and organize policy from the Danish model. And they also, in Greenland, they do define themselves as a welfare state. So that is also why it's not so easy just to break with Denmark, because they still want to uphold all the things that belong to a welfare state, like free schooling, free education, free university, free healthcare, all of these things that is common for the Scandinavian countries.
I wondered what your sense of the effect of climate change on Greenland's economy, and therefore their independence, might be going forward, for better or worse.
Yeah, well, this is, also depends who you are and where you are. Of course, the melting ice is not good for polar bears, and it's not good for sled dogs hunting. But it's good for many other things, like mining. It becomes so much easier to get to those nice minerals. And it's also good for agriculture. Suddenly down in South Greenland, even in the Nuuk Fjord, they can grow potatoes. Very good potatoes. It's good for sheep farming. Southern Greenland is not associated with sled dogs. They don't have them at all because they don't have any ice due to the Gulf Stream. You sledge with your dogs on ice, on sea ice, and they don't have that. So things are getting better due to the milder climate for some. And even for some hunters, they are happy because before they had to go to the ice fjord in Thisted, for instance. They had to go in one morning, then they went to the ice fjord, and then they put up their tent, and they put down their lines for the halibut fishing, and then they stayed overnight, and that is pretty cold. And then they took up the lines and the fish, hopefully in the morning, and then they returned. Now they can go by a small boat there, but the problem is that the halibut like cold water, so maybe they will, go further up north. So this is, for some industries it's good, and of course we are all concerned about climate change, and we are all, concerned of what happens to the cryosphere. I mean, the part of our world that is frozen, what will happen when it's not frozen anymore?
So we've talked a lot about sort of like the political conversations going on between the countries of Greenland and Denmark and also Iceland a little bit too. I was curious, so is there any history of a legacy of violence in this sort of post-imperial era? Are all the tensions that we see mostly in the form of these political discussions, or is there any more extreme actions being taken by extremist groups?
You think from the part of the Greenlanders?
Just across the board, in terms of, I don't know, because
They would say that this discourse about the Greenlanders being primitives and far below the Danes in the evolution of humankind, that is violent. Language can be very violent. They will also say that a lot of those scandals we are talking about, that is violence. But what maybe also sometimes make it more difficult when Danes and Greenlanders are talking about these things is that there is not this, physical violence. So maybe it also becomes more difficult to talk about these things because this psychic violence, which has caused many trauma in the Greenlandic society, that is more difficult for the Danes to see and recognize. The Greenlanders more use irony. They have never, been violent against the Danes, but a Greenlandic guy together with some other guys from the North Atlantic, they did this melting barricades campaign where they borrowed a tank and went to the North Atlantic House, the Icelandic embassy, Greenlandic and various representations, and they took over. They, and then maybe you have seen they made such a wonderful map where they kind of brought their own geography with them. So Denmark is now covered with ice. That might happen actually if the Gulf Stream is turning, then we'll have a new ice age. But and so they renamed everything after themselves and their history and their geography. So suddenly the Danish map was shown with all these Greenlandic names, and that maybe those are such events that make Danes realize what we did to the Greenlanders, because we just made this map, right, with all of our own heritage and our own names and our own language. The first thing the Greenlanders did in 1979 when they got home rule was to change that. And so the Danes had to learn to say Qaqqottoq instead of Julianehåb, and Nuuk is easy, but some of them are more difficult. Holsteinsborg became Sisimiut, the worst one, which is always when you hear journalists in radio, Regattarssuatsiat, oh, that is a hard one, right? And now they want Danes to use Galatlit Nunaat instead of Greenland. And that is a hard one also, because it's difficult to say Galatlit. You can try it. So they claim that the Sami people, they are so lucky because it's so easy to say Sapmi, which is the land of the Sami people, but Galatlit Nunaat, yeah. But even if you say it incorrectly, they will still recognize that you are recognizing them. So we are trying to, when I wrote I usually use Greenland and so on, but when I wrote a new version of Greenlandic literary history, which is my main subject, I shifted. And it feels awkward right now, but when I reached page 28, I had kind of learned, okay, this is fine. We can do this.